So today, joining us for this webinar is Jack Stucker from Regional Housing Legal Services, Bob Damewood from Regional Housing Legal Services, and Holly Glosser from PHFA. Jack joined RHLS in 2013. As a staff attorney, he assists in the development of housing and supportive services using low-income housing tax credits, financing available through the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, and a variety of other federal, state, and local funding sources. Holly Glosser is the Director of Development for the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency. In this capacity, she is responsible for the development and administration of the agency's multifamily loan programs, including low-income housing tax credits and 10 homes. Holly has been with PHFA since 1990 and previously served as an associate counsel. She received a Bachelor of Business Administration degree from Emory University and her Juris Doctor from the Dickinson School of Law. We also have Bob Damewood, and he is from, again, RHLS. He's a development services attorney in the Pittsburgh office. As a development services attorney, Mr. Damewood provides transactional legal services to community-based nonprofits and tenant organizations that are engaged in housing development or community and economic development activities that benefit low-income people. Prior to joining RHLS in 1997, Mr. Damewood was a staff attorney with Northwestern Legal Services in Mercer County, Pennsylvania. He is a 1990 graduate of the University of Akron School of Law. So I'm happy to turn over the presentation to Jack Stucker.
All right, thank you very much, Tori, and the Housing Alliance for the introductions and hosting us for this webinar too, and doing very seamless admin work, making the presentation very easy on our end. So we appreciate it. I'm going to kick off the conversation today with an overview of Section 3 and lay some of the foundation for our discussion. I had a chance to look over the attendee list here, and I know I've worked with a number of you in the past and even specifically on Section 3 issues. So some of this overview may be material and ground that you already know, but hopefully there's some useful gems. I know the PowerPoint's going to be circulated, and throughout the PowerPoint we have a lot of useful resource materials and links and stuff, so I encourage people to think of that as a resource to click through and explore if you want to get deeper dives into some of the topics we're talking about. After my overview, we're going to get to Holly's going to tell us a lot about the exciting employment opportunities in the QAP built into the LIHTC program now, and then Bob's going to take us on a little bit of a deeper dive in Section 3 implementation and talk about some of the Section 3 certification work that both Regional Housing and some partners here in Pennsylvania are working on. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Regional Housing Legal Services, we're a nonprofit law firm who work to advance the housing interests of low-income Pennsylvanians. As you heard in the introductions, a lot of that work is transactional development services representing nonprofits and community groups to build affordable housing. But we also have a pretty substantial policy and programs practice here where we get involved in issues to affect systemic change. And we've been involved in trying to advance the Section 3 program in Pennsylvania for some time now, and Bob's really been a guy in the driver's seat on a lot of that. I've been working with him over the last couple of years on it. So Section 3 is a pretty long-established program. It started with the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. That does mean it's a statutory requirement, so there are regulations that govern the program, of course, but it's not it's not going anywhere because it's enshrined in the legislation itself. So changing tides with federal administrations can have some influence on how much attention is or isn't being paid to the requirements, but the requirements themselves aren't going anywhere. because they're enshrined in that legislation. Because it's part of the HUD's Authorizing Act, covered projects are pretty broad and include most everything that HUD touches. I say here the rule of thumb is it's probably covered. If you're working with any project that's got HUD financing in it, it's likely that it's going to be covered. Public housing has no monetary thresholds, but some other HUD-funded housing or community development stuff does have thresholds that keeps very, very small projects or recipient agencies that have pretty low allocations are excluded from the requirements, but for the most part, projects are going to be covered. Most things are going to exceed those thresholds. I have there a list of the covered programs and links to the HUD page about them. Throughout the presentation, at the bottom of the slides here, we've got links to the regulations that cover the specific topic on that slide, so that may be useful for people who want more in-depth information. One of the reasons why the rule of thumb is that it's covered are because the thresholds are, as we see, per agency, not per activity. So even when the agency's activities are below that $200,000, it doesn't. As long as the recipient agency's allocation is above the threshold, it's going to be covered. And very importantly, that Section 3 will apply to the entire project. So if there's any Section 3 covered money in the project, it means the whole project becomes covered for Section 3 purposes. That's particularly relevant for the LIHTC program because I think Holly can correct me if I'm wrong, but upwards of 80% of tax credit developments have some Section 3 money in them, making the entire projects covered by Section 3 obligations. So you're going to get, with those relatively low monetary thresholds, and that any money means the whole project is covered. That's why, it's helpful to, if you're working with anything that has HUD money in it, to assume that it's going to be covered by Section 3 requirements. In the language, some critics or naysayers of the program in the past have hooked on to this greatest extent feasible language of the Section 3 requirements and say to the greatest extent feasible, and use that as has been used in the past by some people as an excuse to try and paper over the Section 3 requirements. What's been made clear by HUD is that greatest extent feasible means what it says. It means making every effort possible to achieve the Section 3 requirements. We know that if we end up in a compliance situation where HUD's taking a look, that they're not going to accept very laissez-faire activities as meeting the greatest extent feasible standard. Fortunately, in the program are threshold safe harbor requirements that mean as long as those are met, there's no need to get into the really nitty details of what was being done to meet the greatest extent feasible requirement, because if the safe harbor thresholds are met, there's a presumption that that standard was met, and if the threshold requirements are not met, there's a presumption that it isn't. And overcoming those presumptions in any case will be very difficult. So what's going to be really relevant is looking to make sure that these safe harbor requirements are met. I've got them in detail here with links to the regulations that go into some even more detail, but the key takeaway here is these are the thresholds that the recipient agencies are going to be looking to make sure are met for their requirements that HUD's going to want to see are met in order to know that Section 3 greatest extent feasible standard is being respected. So we'll get in a little later talking about what reporting's involved, but all of that is keyed towards seeing that these safe harbor threshold standards have been met. With those standards, we're looking at whether or not Section 3, we're getting down to who is covered by Section 3 on the individual level. This is one of the things where when I've worked with either businesses directly or contractors that are looking to make sure that they're meeting their contractual obligations to meet Section 3. We put the income limits up here because I've talked with a lot of people that are surprised because you talk about low-income residents and people are used to dealing with lower than 80% AMI, which is the Section 3 standard. They hear low income and they're thinking about 50 or even 30% AMI, which is lower income than the Section 3 requirements. At 80% AMI, you're going to have a lot of people that are meeting those income thresholds, and I think it's sometimes surprising to folks working to meet their Section 3 requirements, what these income levels are. So we've put a couple examples from around Pennsylvania up here. You see that it does vary by geography, and the link right there takes you to the HUD website where you can plug in your specific geography, and it'll pull up a table for you for those levels. But I think the important takeaway is that the standard for Section 3 is 80% AMI, which is higher than I think most people assume when they hear low income. We're concerned about who's a Section 3 resident because we need to make sure that's the standard that needs to be met for a Section 3 business to be qualifying. There's three primary ways that a business can qualify, and they're each a little different. So category 1 is going to cover your small businesses predominantly that are owned by a Section 3 resident, so that's someone meeting those income thresholds. These are what I think can be a really transformative business concerns, getting those contracting opportunities to these Category 1 businesses. I think it really gets to the philosophy of the Section 3 program, which is if from HUD's perspective and I think from Congress's perspective, if we're spending money building housing for low-income people or doing community development to help benefit low-income people, we should make sure that the money that's being spent to do the building is working to give solid, sustainable incomes to these to low-income people and to help them lift out of that. The Category 2 businesses are going to be ones that aren't owned by a Section 3 qualifying resident, but employ 30% or more of their permanent full-time workforce are Section 3 qualifying residents. The important thing to note here with Category 2, that the relevant time as far as the income is concerned for the employees is at the time of hire. So even if the employer pays the employee a salary that puts them over the Section 3 income limits, that doesn't disqualify the business from being a Section 3 business concern, because we're looking back to what the employee's income were at their time of hire. So it helps to prevent creating a perverse incentive where employers are targeting their wages to those Section 3 income requirements. So we look back to the time of hire. Category 3 is going to be typically even larger business concerns or employers that do subcontracting, and it means that the 25% of their contracting goes to either a Category 1 or a Category 2. All of these are important categories that can be called. It's my the work that I've done. I think there's a lot of businesses that qualify for Category 2 and either don't know it or haven't done the reporting and the record keeping to certify that, but that they're out there and that they qualify. So I think there's some opportunity there. There's also really good opportunity for folks doing subcontracting, meeting their Section 3 requirements by doing some outreach and working with businesses in the Category 1 option, and we're going to hear a fair amount about what that looks like from Bob later on in this. The recipient responsibilities here are what the recipient agency is required to do. So that's going to be the agencies that are receiving the HUD financing. So it's going to be public housing authorities and counties and municipalities that have allocations from HUD for these covered programs. They're required to comply with them themselves. So we saw that public housing itself is covered, so the recipient agencies have compliance requirements for themselves, and they have to ensure compliance by the folks that they're granting out the money to. They're going to be the primary concern for the recipient agencies here is to help advance the economic interests of their communities and making sure that when they're reporting back to HUD that they can show that they're meeting those safe harbor thresholds. So those are the benchmarks that we know the recipient agencies are looking for in order to meet this ensure compliance standard. If you see the links here, there's some pretty helpful information that HUD's put up about those reporting requirements, which will be useful to recipient agencies themselves to look at, but I think also useful to folks who work with the recipient agencies or receive money from them to understand from their perspective what's going on. There are opportunities for enforcement in the Section 3 program. It's mostly the examples that we have are HUD exercising enforcement against the recipient agencies, which of course agencies want to avoid, but we have seen some examples of enforcement being turning out to be very productive. Particularly Kansas City had a negative letter of finding back in, I want to say it was 2006 or so, but Bob might correct me if I'm wrong. But it spurred them to create what's seen as one of the strongest municipal-based Section 3 programs in the country. There's three primary ways that enforcement can happen. The first is what will be initiated by a third party by filing a complaint with HUD. The second is HUD itself can take the initiative in an enforcement action. And then, of course, litigation can be an option for third parties who think that they've been damaged by someone's failure to comply with their Section 3 requirements. So each of the examples that we have here, I've got links to them. If you're so inclined, when the PowerPoint gets circulated, you can get much more detail for those. But the enforcement often, in all of these cases, has spurred the recipient agencies and their communities to do corrective action that has created much stronger Section 3 programs and economic opportunities in those communities. The mechanics of what happens when there's a complaint is the HUD's going to be looking to see, as I mentioned early on, safe harbors. If someone complains that a agency or contractor is not meeting Section 3, the first thing is, well, did they meet their safe harbor requirements? If they have not and there is non-compliance, you enter the process is to enter into a compliance agreement, which is what can ultimately help spur a good development in creating a stronger Section 3 program. Aside from creating a compliance agreement, the ultimate hammer that HUD has to enforce Section 3 is the same hammer that most federal agencies have, and that's take the money away. And there's a couple different ways that they can take the money away, but they're going to be a lot of motivated recipient agencies and their subcontractors to avoid that. So aside from being motivated to achieve the purposes of the Section 3 program and creating economic opportunities for the communities that the agencies and the folks that they work with serve, there's another reason to be motivated to comply with Section 3, which is ultimately the HUD sanctions that may be involved. So that's the end of my overview. I'm going to hand the mic off now to Holly, who's going to tell us more about the employment opportunities in the LIHTC program, which are separate from but complementary to the Section 3 program. So take it away, Holly.
Great. Thank you very much, Jack, and thank you everyone for listening in this afternoon. Tori, if you can just turn the slide to the next slide. I don't have access. So I did take a look at the list, and I know a number of you are familiar with the low-income housing tax credits, but for those who are not, I'm really just going to give a minute or two overview of the tax credit program. You might hear it as LIHTC or tax credit or low-income housing tax credit, any of those. But at this moment in 2017, it really is the primary financing vehicle for affordable housing in the country, and obviously specifically in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In its history in PA, we have funded over 70,000 units of affordable housing. Most of those are targeted to persons at or below 50% of the area median income. Currently, we have about 1,000 projects that are active in this program. It was enacted under the Tax Reform Act of 1986. So instead of the funding coming through HUD, which most affordable housing was financed prior to 1986, this program is actually funded through a federal tax credit. So it is been a really successful public-private partnership where tax credit equity investment from a whole host of investors actually get a dollar-for-dollar reduction in their federal income tax to help finance affordable housing. Currently, about 70% of the total development cost of a low-income housing tax credit project or affordable project is financed through this tax credit equity investment, and then the other funds are financed through many other mechanisms, including other federal funding that would trigger Section 3. So it really, as Jack said earlier, a number of our developments are also assisted through other federal funding programs. PHFA, the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, is the allocating agency in Pennsylvania of the low-income housing tax credit. We are the only one. In some states, there might be multiple agencies, but in Pennsylvania, PHFA is it. And Section 42 of the code, which is basically our general overarching guidelines, says that we have to allocate pursuant to what's called a qualified allocation plan. The allocation plan is a public document. We get input from various housing partners and both developers and local communities, And it's really our, I call it financing schema, by which an award of tax credits is made. Tori, can you turn the next slide? So again, I mentioned the allocation plan, and the allocation plan is adopted once a year. And in fact, this morning, the agency's 2017-2018 allocation plan was approved by our board. We do have to then forward it to the governor for final approval, and once it's finally signed off on, we will post it on our website. So we expect that to happen shortly. But what the allocation plan does, and it really is the administrative program, and it shows the processing and procedures of how we award the tax credit. And in the allocation plan, there are certain items that I would call threshold criteria, and it could be things like, and these would be the must-haves, and I would say, do not pass go, do not collect $200 kind of thing when you're applying for the tax credit, but they would be things such as development amenities, accessible units, affordability periods, and every development must have these certain things. And then we have things called selection criteria, which are a developer may select a number of these things, and they're points. And the projects that receive the maximum points are the ones that are funded. So we have a number of selection criteria that are location-based or resident characteristics, leveraging of other resources, and certain development amenities. So we have what's called selection criteria, by which a developer will select what types of things that they want to include in the project. And then this is really where I would say that the employment opportunities and a part comes into our allocation plan, is that we have certain set-asides and preferences. And so our set-asides are how we allocate credits, whether they are in an urban location or a suburban location. But our preferences are what types of housing or what's our highest priority. So our preferences are senior housing with services, preservation of existing housing, supportive housing, and a number of those, and they can be found in the allocation plan. Why we have the allocation plan and really some of these competitive or selection criteria is that the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, being the only really funding source right now for affordable housing, is extremely competitive. Each year we receive over 100 applications. Last year we received 110, and we funded 40 of those developments, so it's an extremely competitive program. And each year we have about $30 million worth of the low-income housing tax credits to be awarded to developments. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier we have certain preferences, and so our allocation plan might say at a minimum we are going to fund 3 preservation developments in an urban location, or at a minimum we're going to fund 2 senior developments with services in a suburban location. But we have what would be an overarching preferences after that, and I call these the thumb on the scale. So if we have, after we go through the selection criteria and 2 developments receive equal points, and we can only fund 40, how do we make some distinguishing factors about preferences? And so we have some general overarching preferences, and that's on the slide in front of you, and I'm just going to read it. The agency may also provide a preference to developments using Commonwealth-sponsored pilot programs. And then you'll see in bold, developments providing employment opportunities for property or community residents. And then we say developments or applicants evidencing meaningful participation in the Section 811 program or meeting specific market needs or housing goals. And so you see that italicized, and that was new for 2016. It's the first time we had it in our QAP. That in addition to what folks are doing in the Section 3 arena to provide opportunities for community businesses, long-term employment opportunities for property community residents is now a preference. So really my next just couple minutes I want to spend with you is what we require in our application and also what we saw in a couple of the proposals that came in 2016. Next slide. Our application, for those of you who are familiar with it, would say it's really onerous and sometimes comes in a 3-inch binder. But we do have one of the tabs, and for 2017, 2018, it's going to be tab 46. We're looking at what kind of documentation would support this evidence of an employment opportunity to community folks in the community and otherwise residents. So what we required, or I would say strongly suggested, applicants to provide us these 3 things. An outreach plan by the general contractor to provide employment during construction and rehabilitation. And many proposals gave us their Section 3 plan in this space. The second one was a certification from the general partner or the manager or the management agent that residents would have a first preference for maintenance and service positions at the property. And the third is other evidence as applicable to the property. So what did we see in 2016? And again, this is the first time that we had this as a preference. And what we're seeing now is those proposals that were that we awarded in 2016, they are actually now just starting to close on their financing. So we require the evidence to come in the tab 46, and prior to closing on the financing, we are now looking to those projects that actually put something in, seeking this preference, to provide us with continued assurances that they are continuing to work with the community or to facilitate or further clarify and provide additional outreach in how they're going to execute on their plan. So prior to closing, we are going to require those that sought the preference to provide us additional information. So I'd like to highlight, to spend a minute or two, what's remaining of my time, to give you a couple examples of what we saw in 2016. One of those was the redevelopment of a school property in Pittsburgh. And part of the redevelopment was space that will be set aside in the property for a community center, actually relocating an existing community center into this property. And what the developer provided us is really 4 items. They gave us the outreach plan from the contractor to provide employment opportunities, and it was a really well thought out plan and followed many of the things that Jack outlined in what's required for Section 3. They also provided us with a certification from the management agent. Again, as we indicated on the slide, that a first preference at the property would be given to community residents for maintenance and service positions when they filled it. So they have done that. The third, which is really what we're trying to look at, is expand on opportunities for engaging residents of both the project that we're financing, but also the community, to have that partnership in employment opportunities. Was they worked with the city of Pittsburgh as part of this community center to actually have funding in place for a city parks, or through city parks for the community senior center. And what they have assurances actually from the city is that they are going to work with residents of the development to provide them with employment opportunities, both within the center and also throughout the city of Pittsburgh. So that was something, again, engaging outreach so that the community members would be available to enjoy and have some trainings through the City Park program. And again, as we're getting closer to this project closing, we've reached out to the developer and asked for confirmation on how they were going to do that. So that's really one example of what we're seeing. I would call it is beyond Section 3, as Jack described. The second one, I'll give you another example, is that a nonprofit organization working through, in a citywide program, also in Pittsburgh, coincidentally, in the western part of the state, has a workforce innovation program as part of their supportive housing or supportive services, where they coordinate employment training opportunities between the contractors and the residents. And not only in this existing project, but in other areas that they are throughout the city. It was a well-detailed plan. This development is slated to close shortly, and again, as part of the closing process, we're going to outreach to them. But they really articulated how they can work through local community organizations and businesses to do outreach. This project is a general occupancy development, while the other one was senior. And as part of twofold, as part of their tab in this employment opportunities, but also as part of their supportive service plan or housing services plan, really we're able to articulate how to increase community hiring both within the property and outside of the property. So again, this was new for 2016. The language that I showed you here on the slides exists for the 2017-2018 plan that the board just approved this morning, and so we're really looking forward to seeing other ways that developers are engaging within their local communities to provide opportunities for both residents at the site and outside of the site. Troy, can you switch the slide to the next one? So with that, I just want to give you a little heads up for our 2017-2018 allocation of tax credits. If anyone wants more information about our program, third time's the charm there. We are having a pre-application meeting in Harrisburg on May 10th. It's the afternoon of May 10th at 1 p.m. Information about this meeting is available on our website, www.phfa.org. Those proposals that are seeking 2017-2018 resources need to submit an intent to submit on or before July 7th. Materials for our program will be posted on our website shortly, and then a full application is due to us on September 8th, 2017, and we anticipate making awards in the spring of 2018. We're really excited to be able to put this as a preference. As I said earlier, we consider this the thumb on the scale and determining factor, and are really happy that our board and others are really engaged in this space, because clearly our feeling is that just building developments is what we do, but really serving the residents and providing opportunities is what it's all about for long-term success. So with that, Jack, I'll turn it back to you, or Bob, who's next, and we'll be happy to take some questions at the end.
All right. Well, thanks, Holly. And I just want to say that I'm thrilled that PHFA has adopted this employment preference. It's only the second agency in the country to do so. And like Section 3, I mean, the purpose of this is to basically try to kill two birds with one stone, right? To not only develop housing for low-income people, but to also help low-income people, gain access to economic opportunities that are generated through the development itself and escape poverty that way. I'm going to say a few words about implementation. So how do recipients meet the safe harbor thresholds under Section 3? How can someone how can a recipient operate a program that really gets to, that really produces results that the recipient will be happy with. Okay, let's see if I can change slides here. Here you go. Okay, so a couple case studies, both from the Pittsburgh area. One is one that is a Section 3 program that really wasn't very successful, not for lack of trying. A lot of effort went into it, but the results, weren't very good. And the other is one that where the same general contractor and a different community group really kind of put their heads together and figured out how do we do this better. And so I'd like to go through both of those to point out the differences and why one, how one became more successful than the other. So McKees Rocks Terrace Phase 1 was a Hope 6 and tax credit development, 122 townhouse units. Was certainly larger than the Clairton Townhomes tax credit development, which is the successful of the two. The focus was really on trying to maximize employment, so the general contractor leaned on the subcontractors to hire residents in construction. There was no pre-construction training, no on-the-job training, and really only one resident out of the 14 who were hired had previous construction-related experience. Only 5 of those 14 residents worked through the duration of the job. That was largely because the residents sort of resented the fact that they weren't really being shown the ropes, right? They were just being placed on a construction site, doing menial work, which, is part of what comes with the package, right? But not really, given any skills development, not really being accepted into the existing crews or anything like that. And then the permanent employees resented the fact that these unskilled residents were being paid the same wage that the skilled permanent employees were, and that created a lot of tension and a lot of harassment. And so 9 of the 14 quit during the project. And of the 5 who worked for the entire duration of that job, only one was still employed in the building trades 2 years after the job was finished, and that was the one who had the previous construction experience. So that, is really an example of how not to do it, or, it would probably, the safe harbor thresholds were probably met, so, it didn't create a situation where HUD found the developer or general contractor out of compliance, but as far as producing a result that the developer and general contractor were happy with, that didn't really occur on that job. So the following year, or maybe 2 years later, the same general contractor was selected for a tax credit and home-funded development in Clairton. And the community organization sat down with the general contractor and said, well, let's figure out how to do this in a way that produces better results than what happened at McKees Rocks. And what they came up with was an on-the-job training program, and one that really used the community group to do extensive outreach and screening and vetting of residents. And so this is a much smaller project, but more residents were hired, and it included a thoughtful approach that where 10 residents received classroom training and were then put on the site in an on-the-job training program as two framing crews. Framing was selected because that happens relatively early on in the construction process, and it's relatively consistent, continuous. So you frame, 5-6 days a week. It's not an on and off kind of thing. and when the framing portion was done, residents were evaluated for their progress, and those who graduated, and 8 out of the 10 graduated, or were recommended to move on. They were placed with subs and skilled trades, so with the plumbers, electricians, HVAC, what have you. So out of the 17 who were hired, 15 worked for the duration of the job, and more than half of those were still employed in the building trades 2 years after the job was done. And that's a real success. That doesn't happen very often in training programs. So here's the details. I basically went through the details already. One thing I want to point out is that this costs money. So the community group had to hire a Section 3 coordinator who also operated as one of the foremen for one of the 2 training crews. And also had to come up with pay for pre-construction classroom training, tools, things like that. The biggest expense was inefficiency cost, right? So if you have 2 crews of on-the-job trainees framing houses, that's a lot more expensive. It takes a lot more time to do it that way than if you have experienced crews doing like panelized construction. And so that really was that was pretty expensive, and the contractor ate half of that, and the community group raised the rest to cover the other half of that cost. But again, this is a really successful program. So one thing that really deserves to be mentioned is that Section 3 is an unfunded mandate. HUD doesn't have funding. They don't make funding available to do this well. And so it doesn't have to be done well, but if you're going to do something, you might as well do it well. And I think a lot of the developers and general contractors who do Section 3 want to do it well. Might not know how, might not know where the resources are, but it is possible to do this, to do Section 3 hiring in a way that produces good results. And where CDBG funding isn't available for an on-the-job training program, maybe there's other partners out there, agencies that are already doing on-the-job training. For instance, it could be a youth build program, could be Rebuilding Together Pittsburgh does some on-the-job training with their home rehab, and so it's definitely worth reaching out and finding out what potential partners are out there to do this work. So a word on Section 3 contracting. So as Jack pointed out, there's safe harbor thresholds of 10% of a construction contract going to construction-related Section 3 businesses, and 3% of the contract has to go to non-construction related Section 3 businesses in order to demonstrate the compliance with the greatest extent feasible requirement. Well, so most general contractors, when you talk to them, they ask, well, they say, I would love to contract with a Section 3 business, but where do I find them? Well, one place to find them is, HUD has created a Section 3 Business Registry. The URL is there on this slide. It's a nationwide registry. You can search by trade. You can search by location. I went on yesterday and saw there are 37 registered businesses in Pennsylvania. That's up from last year, so this is expanding. There's 2 issues with the HUD registry, business registry, that are worth pointing out. One is, can you use can you contract with a non-local business, right? And HUD has said yes. So general contractors can contract with a Section 3 business from California if they want, here in Pennsylvania, and get credit, for that toward their Section 3 contracting obligation. theoretically, if there's an equally qualified business in Pennsylvania that does the same work, then that business should receive preference. But non-local contracting is permissible under Section 3. I assume this wouldn't satisfy PHFA's employment preference because that is specifically geared to local residents. But the bigger problem with HUD's registry is that it's no guarantee, just because a business is on the registry doesn't guarantee that they qualify for a preference. And so HUD has this disclaimer on their registry that users of the database are strongly encouraged to perform due diligence by verifying eligibility. Well, that's a problem. There aren't very many general contractors. Look, a job of a general contractor is to get the project done on time and within budget, right? Not very many are necessarily set up to income qualify and determine the eligibility of Section 3 businesses. That's not their strong point, but Section 3 essentially puts that obligation onto general contractors, and so that's a real problem, and that problem hasn't been resolved through the HUD Section 3 registry. To address that problem, here in Allegheny County, RHLS a few years ago created a Section 3 business certification program. We certified over 30 businesses. I think at one point we had 32 or 33 certified businesses here in Allegheny County. Now it's down to 25. Some have aged out of the program, and we've come to the realization that we're a law firm. We're not necessarily good at program delivery, and we are handing this program off to Riverside Center for Innovation, which is much better suited to operate it, and that transition will happen this month. Their website, their URL is on this slide as well. But so if you are interested in finding Section 3 businesses that have been certified as eligible for the Section 3 contracting preference, please contact the Riverside Center for Innovation. If you're doing work in Allegheny County, I realize that not everybody is. Again, keep in mind that non-local contracting is eligible for the Section 3 preference, though. And finally, here are some resources. Here's a link to PHFA's Qualified Allocation Plan being released today. Various Section 3 links, HUD's website, the business registry and their frequently asked questions, and then a link to Riverside Center for Innovation. And finally, if you have any questions, please feel free to give me a call. If you want to get a hold of the Riverside Center for Innovation, please call Judy McNeil, and her number is on this last slide. And so with that, I'll hand it back to Jack, and I think we can open it up to questions.
Great, thanks, Bob. This is Tori with the Housing Alliance. So thank you, Bob, Jack, and Holly for presenting today. We have about 5 minutes, so if people have any questions, we do have quite a bit of people on the line. So if you have a question, please press, we're going to keep people muted. If you have a question, please press *7 to unmute yourself to ask a question, or you can type a question in the chat box on the bottom left. So again, we have about 5 minutes. So any questions, please ask them at this time. Again, *7 to unmute. Do people have any questions? So we have one from Heidi. Do you have any successful examples of projects for the Philadelphia region?
Well, I think Jack is probably in a better position to answer that than I am.
Yeah, I can't think of anyone that makes a good example like what you shared there, Bob. I mean, the developments that I've worked on in the Philadelphia area, of course, are compliant with Section 3. But as far as doing some of the real heavy lifting community development and outreach work like you went into there, Bob, I unfortunately don't have a real good example in the Philadelphia area. That's not to say that there might not have been that has not hit my radar.
Yeah, I seem to remember APM doing some good work around Section 3, but I really don't know the details of the kind of work they've been doing.
Okay, do we have any, let's see, can the local RHLS group utilize the programs written for the other areas mentioned? Can they develop and share with us? This is from Denise.
Hello?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand that question.
Denise, star 7 to unmute. Can you explain a little bit what you were asking in that question?
Hi, it's Denise. Hello. I thought you mentioned earlier that you guys developed a specific agenda and program for the Pittsburgh area, and was wondering if our local regional housing legal services could utilize that program down here in Montgomery County.
Well, okay, we actually worked with Montgomery County to do something similar in Montgomery County, and I believe the Department of Economic Development may be setting up their own sort of business certification program in Montgomery County. Jack, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that's true. Our contract with the county has ended at this point, so it's sort of unfortunate that's not. We did have, we did certify some businesses in Montgomery County, but they're not active now that our contract's ended. I know that was the plan, and that we were going to work to help them set that up. But once I haven't heard the latest news from in the county there. But you're right, Bob, that there was a plan to do something internally there.
And in general, if anybody who's listening wants to create their own business certification program, we would be glad to work with you to help walk you through that.
I think that's a really important point, Bob. Yeah, I think as Bob was saying with the Allegheny County and the experience in Montgomery, we learned that Regional Housing Legal Services is a law firm, not a program administrator in that way, but we would be very, I think, interested and happy to work to provide some counsel to anyone looking to set up that program, so we could provide some advisement on the regulations and on the legal side of certifying Section 3 businesses if there were partners who were interested in doing those programs.
Well, thanks, gentlemen. I did not realize that our Economic Development Department has worked with you guys, and I will reach out to them.
Great, thanks. And just before we get off the call, we have Steve. I see your hand is raised. Star 7 to unmute. Do you have a question?
Hi there.
Hi.
My question is, what time in the development process should we start to submit either outreach plans to our PHFA development officer, or how should we be communicating with PHFA as we proceed with the project?
Good question, and thank you. I think one of the things that many who have worked with PHFA know that we offer technical assistance all along the way for various reasons. So whether it's on, operating numbers or some assumptions. So if you have a proposal that you think we should consider and you want us to take a look at it, feel free to send it along to either my attention, and it's hglauser@phfa.org, or as you're submitting your intent to submit, please feel free to send it along with us, and we would be happy to discuss any thoughts we might have to either expanding on or helping you to facilitate some additional partnerships.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for getting on the call today, or the webinar today. Really appreciate it. Again, if you have any questions, you can send me an email for follow-up, or use the contact information on these slides. We will send out the slides today, as well as the recording. Thanks again, and have a great rest of the week and a great weekend.